All right, so this is kind of the next part of the report writing. The original report writing we just discussed, very basic, here's how you write reports. Now we're going to shift because we're adding on how do you focus on achievement data in report writing. So some of this is still the same. You have to write reports based off of any of these things, psychological tests, interviews, systematic behavior, etc., etc. So pretty much anything that is relevant should still be added. So pretty much all the other rules that we discussed already still apply. The big issue here we're talking about is the specific section set aside for achievement. Remembering that the purposes of the report are to provide accurate assessment data, some sort of basis so that the reader can know the reader can know exactly what it is that you're thinking as you put the report together. Make sure that you talk about any kind of research that relates to it. Baseline information is helpful to talk about change over time. And then this also does serve as a legal document. So that is just something to keep in mind. So let's talk about specific interpretation relative to achievement. If you go into the tables, you're going to see something like this. On the left here, take a look. This should be very familiar to you. Here, you'll notice it says 95% confidence bands. I prefer 90% confidence bands, but whichever one you use, just make sure that you update that in the table to be reflective of what you selected in your report. It's the same as everything else we've talked about. You enter the standard scores, you enter the confidence bands, and you change the date administered and who administered it. So one of the things I want you to see here is that there are a lot of different pieces of data. We don't really care about all of them because the main focus of achievement scores is twofold. One is to rule out or to use this data as part of an intellectual disability diagnosis. So if ID is your question, this total achievement here is what you care about. And you do not need every single one of these subscales in order to get a total achievement. So you would want to give the subscales you need just for a total achievement. And then here you have the 8 areas of possible learning disability diagnosis. And you don't need every one of these if you, like for instance, if you're thinking, oh, I think this person has a math problem. You may want to go ahead and give all 3 of these math fluency subscales. But if you don't think the person has a math problem, maybe just basic math problem solving and computation, and that's all you need to do. And so you're going to pick and choose which scales that you give based off of your 8 priority questions. Just something to remember, if the person is having any kind of oral language deficits or expression or listening comp, they're probably having reading and writing problems as well. So you probably just want to go ahead and add those in. If a child is having a reading problem, you're probably going to also want to screen for oral expression or listening comp. And you're also going to want to look at writing. So in particular, those language heavy ones really are, you're going to kind of want to get a complete picture. So down here where it has total reading, basic reading, etc., etc., the only one of note that we tend to use, or the only 2, is the total achievement and the written expression composite score. And that's because the written expression composite score usually is made up of something like the sentence composition and the spelling. And just don't forget that spelling in of itself is not a learning disability. Written expression is. But if spelling is included in a written expression composite, you can count spelling as kind of part of the construct. And a lot of times sentence composition may not be what you're aiming for. The person may be able to write individual sentences, but they can't write entire paragraphs or make a structured argument. So you may choose and pick different achievement tests to measure different kinds of achievement problems. But down here in this composite section, unlike with IQ tests, you don't really care as much about the composites with the exception of the total achievement for an intellectual disability diagnosis in the schools. Remember, you don't need achievement out in private practice. And the written expression. You report them anyway because the teachers may care about that as part of intervention planning. You report every piece of data. Or next time the child is evaluated, having that data could be really helpful. So we put it here and we interpret it, but that's not where our focus is, and that's not where we're going to spend a lot of time intervention planning and things like that. We do have the sub-focus. The first is to make a diagnosis. The second is to plan some sort of intervention. So within intervention planning, it's twofold. One is, does the child have a learning disability in one of the 8 areas, and do we want to place them into a special education classroom? So those specific subscales, you'll use subscales related specifically back to that, one of those 8 areas of learning disability. The other is, okay, so they're having problems. Having problems in reading doesn't really necessarily tell me anything. Even saying that the person is having problems in reading fluency is still fairly limiting. It'd be really nice to know, is it speed that they're having problems with? Is it accuracy? Is it prosody? Like, what kind of reading fluency problem are they having? Because you can't build an intervention unless you know what the issue is. And so you would want to pull the data that you get from this test. Unlike with the IQ tests where we really just looked at composite scores for the most part. Here, the subscales are so important, and then down to the item level, where you use the items to do an error analysis. That is just where it's so different from previous reports. And then there's everything else. It's all this other data that we've discussed as being there, but we don't really need. All right, so within this area of using achievement tests, the most important strengths and weaknesses are normative ones. And you'll notice this slide talks about relative ones. But, for the DSM, it's basically, do you have an unusually low achievement score in one of these 3 areas? And so what they're saying is normatively based, is it unusually low? And there's a whole nother class where we talk about what unusually low is defined as. But there's less of a focus now than there ever was before on relative strengths and weaknesses specific to achievement testing. But it's still helpful sometimes to put this in there. It's also helpful, let's say you have a person who has a high IQ and they seem to be struggling in reading, but they're still reading at like 105, but they have a 135 IQ. You can really say, yes, you're struggling for you, but you're actually doing fine compared to other people. So if you're going to be doing a relative strengths and weaknesses analysis, you can only do it if you've given an IQ test to that individual. There's no point in having anything at all about relative strengths and weaknesses. You can't go back to the total achievement score and use that. That's just not how it works. You have to have had an IQ data. So over here, this is kind of the stuff you fill in. And the stuff you fill in is filled in through this kind of information. First, you have to have your best estimate of G. For this class, you would probably want to, for your final paper, you're going to end up giving to your, the kid that you're giving this achievement test to really should be somebody you already gave an IQ test to, because that gives you've already calculated G for that person. And so that's easy enough. And then you form the band around G, and then you determine which ones fall outside of that, either relative strength or relative weakness. The only really big difference between how this works and how strengths and weaknesses work cognitively, one is that we use subscales here. We used only composite scores for IQ, but we use subscales here for relative strengths and weaknesses for achievement. And the best estimate of G comes from a different test. So that's just something to keep in mind. Error analysis is the other thing you're going to be doing. So take a look over here. Here is your error analysis text. Going over here, your first step to doing an error analysis is figuring out anything that's a normative weakness. You don't care about personal or relative weakness in your error analysis. You only care about normative weakness because, and with a learning disability situation, it's twofold. You have to have the weakness, but it also has to be, and you have to need special services and education for you to get any kind of additional interventions. And so we're looking at normative weaknesses only. If you don't have a normative weakness, don't do the error analysis. That's just how it works. So you may have given a bunch of subtests and none of them had a normative weakness, then you don't have to do error analysis. 2 of them had a normative weakness. Yes, you have to do an error analysis, but only on those 2. 3 had a normative strength. Don't do those. We're only talking about doing error analysis for normative weakness at the subtest level. Most of the more recent achievement tests do have error analysis built in. And so when you are taught how to give, say, the KTA or the Wyatt, we'll be discussing how our error analysis works at that time. So preferably you're not going to be looking at the individual items and making your own decisions as to whether or not that's a strength, that's an error type or not. Usually those are already embedded. So then when you go to write it out, I tend to want to talk about what the child can do. So what's the highest thing they can do, and then what's the lowest thing they can't. And that gives the teacher a range. So here's the example I have here. He can add and subtract whole numbers, but he struggles with fractions and the multiplication of whole numbers. Now, notice I didn't talk about division or calculus. I don't need to, because if he can't do multiplication, he can't do division. So I didn't talk about anything higher than that. And I didn't talk about anything lower than adding and subtracting whole numbers. I didn't say he's able to identify his numbers, because if he can add and subtract, you know he can identify. So the idea would be that you take the information that's available and provide information directly to the person who's going to be doing the intervention to say, this is where we need to have this targeted. So for him, right now, the target for him either needs to be multiplication and or fractions, and that's at the basic level of understanding. And from this error analysis, that's what you're going to make your recommendations. Remembering that recommendations go at the end of the report. Remembering, too, that recommendations should be 1 to 3 recommendations for each academic, cognitive, and social-emotional behavioral weakness. So if you should already have had your recommendations for the cognitive part from fall. So you just copy and paste that straight on in. You don't have to make any changes unless I gave you feedback saying that you needed changes on your final report. Each academic area, so that's academic normative weakness, ones that you did error analysis for. And then finally, the social emotional ones. Ideally, at the end of summer, you will have done your social emotional behavioral assessment class. And with that, you will be able to add the social emotional behavioral data straight into your final report. So you will have the IQ data from the fall class, the psychoed data from the spring class, and the social emotional data from the summer class, and you will have a complete psychological report. Any research that you or intervention you're going to be adding should be cited and should be research-based. We will have an entire day where we go into how you determine research-based interventions and how you alter them specifically to fit your targeted child. And they got to be feasible. That has to do with that altering stuff. It costs a lot of money. You may not be able to use it. If it's something that the teacher's not going to do or not responsive to, or that you don't think that this child can actually do because maybe they have visual impairments or hearing impairments to go along with it. So you really are going to have to target your interventions. Not just, this is an intervention for a reading problem. They need to be specific to the type of errors the child is having, and they need to be feasible to be done realistically for this child. And special ed is not enough. Like, you need to give some sort of idea as to how folks can move forward. And again, we're going to spend a whole day just on this topic. You do have to have, in addition to having citations next to your recommendation, you have to have a reference list at the end. The last of this is just for general reminders from the previous set of slides, so I'm just going to go through them really quickly. There is a set order of how things look, your background, this is the same as what you learned in the fall. Previous testing, here you go. If you do have any achievement test data, things like the FSA, FCAT, whatever they're calling it, ITVS, CRC, whatever it is that they're calling it, even things like SAT or GRE, you can put those in here too if you want. It's not required. Then you have the test observation section, remembering that you need to have an observation for every single session that's clear as to what date that observation is for and what was given at the time, and and if there were any validity issues, those need to be discussed. You talk about the test administered, make sure you use the name that the publisher does. IQ tends to come first, adaptive, then, again, this says more on the next slide. I'm not sure if there is more. That might be in the previous set of slides. Academic and achievement comes after adaptive, and the social emotional behavioral are last. All right. And then your summary, never, ever, ever put new information in your summary. Everything in there should reflect something you saw before. Why did they come? Was the test session valid? Give just a real basic information about IQ. Make sure you tell what the name was. Best estimate of G and any strengths or weaknesses. Achievement is the same thing. Strengths and weaknesses listed. Make sure you say whether or not you're talking about relative or normative. And the social emotional behavioral will, you're just going to tack on that as well. So you notice total should be about 5-6 sentences. It should not be a recreation of the entire report. Your signature line is the same. The diagnoses, if you're going to be doing them, then you would put those here. I haven't been requesting that y'all do that for this class, mostly because in the schools, you're not supposed to give a diagnosis on your reports. So I figure this is something you guys can do when you get to practicum and or internship. Recommendations, we just mentioned what all of those need to be, but they go last. So you don't put them in the section where you're seeing the problem. You make sure that you put them at the end after your signature line and diagnosis, but before your psychometric summary table, where all the tables go. Writing tips, just some general stuff. When you're done, take a look at it. I always recommend that you guys submit it to me as a PDF, and that way you can get a chance to see what it looks like. If you submit something to me, paper or PDF, just look at it. Does it look like it was made by a professional or does it not? Could the average person sort of pick it up and read it? Make sure the spelling and grammar have been checked. I tend to recommend that you guys write whatever it is you're going to write, finish it up at least a couple of days before it's due, because then you have 24 hours to let it sit and for you to read over it again. And then does everything look consistent? Are you using the same font size, same spacing, same everything throughout it? So just make sure you do edit. And then there are, of course, additional resources available for you on Canvas. And then there are templates available as well. So remembering there's no such thing as plagiarism. You can copy and paste directly, and you're good to go. All right, I hope that this helped clarify some of the differences between cognitive report writing and achievement report writing, with some ideas towards social emotional behavioral reports as well.